here's where it all happened. The Mabee Center, located on the campus of Oral Roberts University. For over 2 decades, ORU President Oral Roberts taught hundreds of classes on one subject, the Holy Spirit in the Now. The devil uses opposition as a powerful weapon to attack your faith in God and His direction for your life. Hello, I'm Ray Lewandowski, and you're about to relive one of the classic Holy Spirit in the Now classes as taught by Chancellor Oral Roberts, founder and then president of Oral Roberts University. Last time, Chancellor Roberts dealt with opposition by candidly describing the successes and struggles of his ministry. In what would be the last recorded Holy Spirit class, Chancellor Roberts concludes his discussion on opposition and the importance of a believer in the midst of it, maintaining integrity and a strong, unshakable faith in God. From September of 1988, here is the session entitled, Don't Go Against the Kingdom of God, Part 2.
There's never been a time since 1947 that the opposition has not been there. Now why? This is another principle of abundant life. The devil knows who God is. He knows Jesus, and he knows those who Jesus is in. And he knows those who are using their faith more. And the devil is a scared devil. The devil knows his time is short. The devil knows he's a defeated foe. And the only release he gets is in the opposition he brings. And he has fought, and he had fought me. There were times, not only the one at Chanute when I felt like quitting, it was when ministers would misunderstand and would sometimes come against me en masse in one place. A whole group of pastors asked for a conference. They had only one request: get out of town. Don't preach that stuff in this city. This is our city, and you have no right. And I said, I have a right. I'm an American. I'm a Christian. I'm a preacher. I'm going to preach it, brother. I'm going to pray for the sick. And I stood my ground. And so when God said, son, you've been faithful up this hour, it was like God took me in his arms. And it meant more to me than it might have meant at some other time. And he said, you'll feel my presence in your hand. And immediately my mind went through the Bible, almost book by book, as I remembered signs that God had given, like the rod in Moses' hand, and the 7 locks of hair on Samson's head, and the shadow of Peter, and the special miracles by the hands of Paul. All these things just ran through my mind because I had no precedence for this. And I looked at my right hand, and it was like a warm liquid was flowing through it, like electrical current that began at my elbow, came down through my hand. I looked at my left hand, and there was nothing in it. And there was this little boy, stone deaf in one side, his mother said, and very badly affected on the other. He had not heard my sermon, just the sound. And I crossed my hand because the stone deaf ear was on my left. And I felt it when the ear popped open. And then I changed my hands over to the other ear, and it popped open. And the little boy just yelled out loud because he heard the sounds. And I was so sure that the little boy was healed, I didn't test the child. I said to his mother, step behind him and speak to him in a normal voice. And the little fellow whirled around. He had heard her. And I said, ask him to repeat. And he did. And she took that little fellow in his arms. I knew. Young people, I knew. I was on the little end of the biggest thing I'd ever known. The mighty presence of God. And there's a woman who had been brought in a kitchen chair, who for years had been bound by arthritis. And she could walk if somebody held her up. And I couldn't wait till I got to her. I went over there. I reached out that hand, and it was like it was on fire. And she came out of that chair. I tell you, you may have never seen anybody dance in the Spirit. She got up and danced all over that place. Oh. And I would just look at my hands. They didn't look any different. And then it would leave. I went to another place, and there was a couple of young women that my wife and I had known since they were children, the Morris sisters. Irma was the oldest, and she had tuberculosis and had it arrested in the sanitarium. And she came up for prayer. And when I touched her, she said, "Oral, what did you do to me?" I said, "I don't know what you mean." She said, "When you touched me with your right hand, it was like liquid fire went through my lungs." And I said, "Irma, I feel the presence of God in my right hand." And then I learned that when it was not there, I could still function. I didn't have to have it. But when I had it, it was a point of contact that made me an entirely different person. It seemed like I could preach and the stars would fall. It seemed like I could face a den of lions. When it wasn't there, I'd still preach, I'd still pray, some would still get healed. But when the presence of God came in that hand, it changed everything. And I'll say this, without it, without that particular sign, and that's what it is, a sign, not personal power to myself, none of this would ever be here. Because the opposition was so great, the misunderstanding so severe, that without some sign in my life, we could not have gone through those things and continued to grow. It was not long after that until I received a call to two great cities. At that time, I was still mostly in churches, just in an auditorium once in a while. And I went to this particular church that seated 12, maybe 1,200 people. It was 28 below zero, and the people came and filled it up. And at that time, they would receive one offering a week for the expenses of my team and of the hotel rooms and stuff like that. Then they would receive one love offering on a Saturday night for my family back in Tulsa. And the other offerings, there were 7 nights a week, so there were 5 offerings for the church. So on this particular night, the pastor of the church got up and received the offering from me and from my family. And my brother Vaden was with me at that time. And Evelyn had come. She was pregnant with Richard at that time, and I didn't know it. That's just an aside. And the next day, when he was supposed to have brought the offering over to us, Vaden came to me, and he said, "You know, the man hasn't turned the offering over to us." Oh, I said he will. And he drove up in a brand new car. And Vaden said, "Well, I'm going to go in there and ask him." Oh, he said, "I bought me a new car with that money last night." And Vaden was not maybe as spiritual as he could have been. And he just almost reached out and got the old boy. And he came back to me, and I said, "Vaden, don't you do that." Well, he said some choice words. And I said, "Let me go in and talk to him." And the man never hid a thing. He said, "I did it." He said, "The night I receive your offering, it's always larger." He said, "I need a new car." But I said, "You told the people it was for us." Well, he said, "What are you griping about?" He said, you're doing okay." I said, "That's right. But that's beside the point. What's going to happen to you? What's going to happen to your soul? Now, I'm telling you that, and I'll get to the reason in a minute, because it has to do with John 10:10. And this man recommended me to another large church in another large northern city. And when I got there, drove up, got out of the car, and the man met me to take me to the hotel. His first question was, "Are your miracles real?" I said, "My miracles?" I said, "Sir, I can't do any miracles." Oh, he said, you know what I mean. When you pray for the sick, are those miracles real?" I didn't know where he was coming from. It seemed like everywhere I turned, I always met that guy that was a thief and a killer and a destroyer. And naive, I said, "Well, you're going to be in charge of the meeting. You stand by them in the healing line. You decide if they're real." But there was something deeper. There was a spirit across America in 1947 and 48 that you could almost cut with a knife, of unbelief, of doubting miracles. The old fundamentalists that believed that miracles had ceased with the apostles when they died. Brother, they were really in charge of this nation. Everywhere we went, we ran into that bunch. And they had infected many of the Pentecostals who knew how to preach it and to say the right words and the right doctrine, but didn't have any part in doing it. And this is one of them. And he's one of the big ones. Will I ever forget, are your miracles real? So I plunged into that revival, and this pastor sat on the stage with his arms across his chest. You ought to try it sometime, to preach and to start to pray for the sick. Let's see you do it. And you knew you couldn't heal. You wished you could, but only God could do it. You knew it came by faith. And if you didn't preach the word, the faith wouldn't be there. And you were depending upon believing in God and the people having faith. And you may not know it now, but strong leaders in certain places can tie a whole service up. And we struggled through that week. And at that time, I began to realize, and this is why I'm telling the story, I'm going to have to find a way out of this. And I conceived the idea of a big tent. And we had several tents. We started with 3,000 and went to 12,000. And our biggest tent was the size of Maybe Center. When you seat the platform, this place seats 12,000. And that's what our biggest tent seated, 12,000. And you might not know it, but in those early days, there were not many large auditoriums across America. And so we decided to have our own auditorium. We bought our own folding chairs, thousands of them, a big piano and Hammond organ and platform and the big stainless steel trailers and the trucks and we just had the whole thing. We just started out across America with this big auditorium, and we'd find a big vacant space and rent it. And sometimes the preachers would get together and go to the city council, and they wouldn't give us a license to put up our tent. And that would hit the headlines across America, preacher barred from conducting revival in this city. I can name you a dozen of those cities. Gives you that warm feeling, Larry, right here in your stomach. But you know, God knew something about me I didn't know. He knew if that opposition didn't come to me, I would never develop. I never understood that then. I used to beg him to take that stuff away, and he never would. But God knew without it, I would never develop and be strong. The devil would overcome me. And there's one mistake the devil makes. The first mistake he makes is to come against you. Because if you stand still, you'll knock him out every time. You will do it. And you will develop. And I realized what I needed to do was to have a crusade manager. And one of the greatest men we've ever had was Reverend Bob DeWeese. What he did in Tacoma, Washington, where he was pastor, he organized the pastors, invited us with the big tent, and when I got there, it was not one preacher in control. Pastors were sitting on the same platform together and having fellowship.
Let me stop you just a minute.
Pardon?
Let me stop you just a minute.
All right, do that.
I think one reason those pastors in those two cities acted the way they did was to get you out of one denomination into the world.
Yes.
You see, that's what happened. You quit going to denominational churches to have your meetings. And if you had stayed with those, you never would have gotten out and preached this message to the world. So God had to allow, and I don't think God had them do what they did. I think the devil had them do what they did, but God turned it around and used it to make your thinking bigger.
Right.
And to realize you had to get out from one denomination into the world and let all denominations come to the Crusades.
Yes, you and I talked about in the book of Acts, there was just one body of Christ.
That's right.
There wasn't a bunch of denominations. Everybody was in the same group. You remember that?
That's right.
And we kept wondering how that we could all be in different denominations and yet leap over the boundaries and be brothers and sisters. That's what we talked about. And the reason I mentioned Brother Deweese is I asked him to become the crusade manager. And he would travel and set up the crusades and say to the pastors, if you don't come together, he won't come. And by that time, the crusades had gotten big and powerful in soul winning and healing, and they were calling us from border to border and ocean to ocean. They really wanted us, but usually one pastor would want a sponsor, and Bob DeWeese say, no, he won't come unless you come together. You sit on the platform, and some of them had never sat together before.
That's the truth.
That's the truth. That was a major change in the United States, in the church world.
It was the first point of unity of pastors in a city. These pastors wouldn't sit on the platform with each other. They wouldn't speak to each other a lot of times. They would never have a meeting together. And when Bob DeWeese got there, he said, you'll either meet together and pray together and sit on the platform together, or Oral Roberts won't come. So he started all this. He started all this unity among pastors, and it's led to what it is today. Now pastors everywhere get together, and in those days they wouldn't do it.
We got the big tent, and here's the way we did it. In these churches, I would take one night and I would say, I'm asking 100 people to give $10 a piece, because it's going to cost $40,000 or $50,000 to buy the big tent and the chairs. That was a lot of money in those days, folks. And as usual, I was trying to pay as I went and not be in debt. And I said, if 100 will do it, I'll ask for no more. I'll stop. And when it started rolling, and we hit the 100, there'd be others stand up, and I'd say, no, I'll not accept the money. And I established something of integrity. That was very important that I stopped. And that went across America. And there began to develop a feeling of trust in me by many, many pastors. And I say part of abundant life is keeping your word. Keeping your word. Everybody say it. Keeping your word. We took the big tent for the first time that we used it to Durham, North Carolina. There were a group of ministers there who had invited us. And I'm going to tell you about the Durham crusade because a couple of things happened that are important to John 10:10 and to your life. We couldn't get the tent up. It was brand new. We had the set of instructions, and I was in charge of putting the tent up. And the presence of God might have been in my hand, but it never worked in putting tents up. And it didn't fit a hoe handle either. My wife used to say, honey, how can you preach with such anointing and you have no ability with your hands around the house? It's just one of the afflictions I had to put up with in my life. We got a bunch of men, and we got the tent up just barely above my head, and we couldn't get the thing up. Supposed to start the crusade, and we couldn't get the tent up. And oh, it was the month of June, it was blazing hot, and under that canvas it was hotter. And we were whipped. And I remember I walked off to the edge, just outside that huge piece of canvas, and I was talking. Evan says that I'm talking all the time when I'm by myself, and she can't tell if it's to myself or to God. And I was out there talking. I said, God, you sent me here. Let me get this tent. I'm going to put this thing up. I'm going to put this tent up. I'm going to put this tent up. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. And somebody tapped me on the shoulder. He said, Brother Oral, this was North Carolina, Brother Oral. They call me Oral. Brother Oral? I said, yes, sir. He said, preacher? They also use that word out there. They walk up to a man of God and they address him, preacher. Preacher, you can't get the tent up. I said, that's right, but I'm going to get it up. He said, you go to your motel. We'll get the tent up. And I stood there, and he walked over to this group of men who were trying to put up the tent. He said, it's evident we can't get it up. I have a little money. Maybe you have a little. Let's go hire some men, and let's find somebody who's had some experience in putting up a tent. And I went on home, that is to the motel, and they found an old circus man. And the man said, you stay till we call you. We would open on Thursday, didn't open until Saturday. It took that long to get the tent up. He called me, and I came back and saw that big tent. The chairs, thousands of them were spread out. What a feeling to look over that. And during the crusade, they brought groups of little boys and girls who were born deaf and dumb. They say now deaf and without speech, but in those days they called them deaf and dumb. I didn't know it, but there was a school near the tent where they had scores of these little boys and girls born deaf and dumb. And there was a businessman in town, a Baptist, who had fallen in love with the ministry, came out to help. And he brought these little boys and girls. Never occurred to me that God couldn't open ears and unstopped tongues that couldn't talk. And those little fellows began to get healed. And as they did, they would scream because they'd never heard noise. Then I would teach them how to talk. And it was just absolutely fascinating. And I was the most fascinated of anybody there. I would get down on my knees to this little fellow or this little girl, and I'd pray, and the ears would pop open. And they didn't know how to talk, and I'd teach them to say their name and say the name God and so on. And the next thing I knew, the word was out in town that I had a wire up my sleeve. And that's how I was getting them healed. And I said, where's the wire? I'd like to have one. If it'll open deaf ears and loose tongues, I'd like to have that wire up my sleeve. Of course, that wasn't true. Then they said he's got some wires under the platform. And the power comes up through the platform and makes these little children hear. I tell you, folks, it was really interesting to see, if you could survive it, to see how all that was taking place. But the word was spreading everywhere. And then that was 1948 in the month of June, and they would not let the black people in the tent. The black people stood on the outside. So I came up with a brainstorm. I wouldn't dare do this today, but back there I had to do something. I said to the people in the audience, on Monday night, you're not coming to the tent. We have called many of the black pastors, and Monday night, we're going to have church for the black people of Durham. And that went over like a lead balloon. And when, I had no idea if we'd fill the tent, but when we drove up, not only was it full, but they were singing a song that maybe you've heard, Shine on Me. And folks, ain't nobody can sing like black people singing Shine on Me. Nobody. I walked in there, I thought I'd be raptured. I walked up on that stage. We had 63 black pastors on the stage, and one of them got up and introduced me as Elder Roberts. And I took my Bible, and brother, I began to preach, and about an hour later, they were saying, sick him, come on. And I said, if you don't stop, you're going to kill me. You're going to preach me to death. I mean, I'm telling the truth. You talk about bringing the preach out of it. If you can't preach to them, you better go home. I made the invitation, I started praying for the sick, and as they were coming by in the line, I heard a voice. I looked, and it was a young black mother with a little boy, and she was saying, God, all I want is for my little boy to see. God, just let him see. And she came on up, and she looked up at me, she said, man of God, all I want is for my little boy to see. Well, she'd have to kill me. I mean, I cried so hard, I just hardly knew where I was. She said, all I want, man of God, is for my little boy to see. I touched that little boy, and his eyes opened, and that crowd exploded. And I exploded. I'm telling this story for a reason, because it's got an aftermath. I knew I was holding something. I knew what I was doing was dangerous in that part of the world at that time, but I knew I had hold of something. It wasn't the way I'd like for it to be done, but at least I was starting something. And we got into the early 50s. This was a long time before the civil rights thing came. And the black people and the white people all came, and by that time they had a segregated area in the tent where the black people could sit. But when I made the invitation, no matter who they were allowed to come. They came up to be saved. They came in the heating line. I made no difference whatsoever until one night I got an ultimatum. Bob Deweese and Colin Steele, who many of you will remember being here, he's with me over 30 years handling the big tent. They came to me and said, they're going to shut the meeting down tomorrow night. You're going to have to take the tent out of town, and they're not going to let you have the black people up in the invitation to be saved or in the healing line. So life comes to a place where the rubber meets the road.
The devil cometh.
Huh?
The devil cometh.
The devil cometh.
The thief cometh. To steal, to kill,
steal,
and destroy.
to kill, and destroy.
That's right.
I tell you, we met him. Yeah. We know who he is, and we know his nature. Yeah. And let me tell you a story right quick. There was a turtle going to cross a big, deep, and wide river. And a scorpion said, let me ride on your back. And the turtle said, no, you'll sting me. He said, no, you're my friend. I won't sting you. He said, well, you're my friend, so ride on my back. Out in the middle of the river, the scorpion stung the turtle, and as he was going down, he said, I thought you were my friend. He said, I am, but it's my nature to sting. Oh, did I learn something? It's the nature of the devil to steal and to kill and to destroy. So Brother Deweese and I and the sponsoring pastors met, and the sponsoring pastors felt they were caught in a jam, and so I got off alone with Brother Deweese and Colin Steele, and I said, I'm not going to tell you what I'll do. I'll show you what I'll do. And the next night, I preached and started to make the invitation for the unsaved, and I stopped. I never said a word, then got deathly still. I said, there has been a threat. In a minute, I'm going to ask people to come down to God's altar and to be saved. And I defy anybody in this city to stop anybody, regardless of their color, to come to God's altar. And you talk about still. And then I said, every head bowed, and I prayed. And all those who want to be saved, raise your hand. All of you, raise your hand, come forward. The whites and the blacks came, stood side by side. You could cut it with a knife. And then I said, we're going to start the healing service. And I defy anyone to stop any sick person coming for healing. And we were not stopped. Now, I didn't take the second step. I should have taken the second step, but I didn't know how. And it was sort of a compromise in a way, because I could have, at that moment, I could have seized the moment. But something good, the seed of equivalent benefit, was planted and reaped in my next crusades. We got to the next city, we never said a word. And the white and black people integrated in our tent. And from that moment in the early 50s until now, including the opening of Oral Roberts University, the young blacks and whites came, and the second year the president of the student body was a young black. And it's been that way long before. And recently a group of black pastors called upon me, among which was Carlton Pearson, and they learned about that. We never talked about it. It seemed like a little thing, but you sure could feel something going up and down your spine. Can you imagine people who believe in God, that they love God and they love all people, and one's white and one's black and one's Indian and one's Chinese and one this, and they say, I like you and I don't like you? Can you imagine?
There are a lot of them still like that.
Pardon me?
There are a lot of people still like that today. And it's just got to stop, that's all.
In the name of Jesus, I would come against it. Yes. We will not have it on this place, on this campus. This is God's university. It belongs to God's people. I've got a couple of interesting things I've just got to. Yeah, I've got about 10 minutes, 15. We took the tent back to Ada, Oklahoma, where I was healed. Two fascinating things happened there that concerns abundant life. The doctor, one of the doctors who had worked on me when I had tuberculosis, after I was healed, they sent my sputum, that's spit, by the way, to Oklahoma City, to the laboratory, and the word came back, no TB found. But the doctor who had done the most work, Dr. Morey, of the Sug Clinic in Ada, wanted to fluoroscope my lungs after that the healing came, and he fluoroscoped me and found that I was clear. And when we put the big tent up in Ada, my hometown, where I used to sell papers on the streets as a little boy, and little hometown boy is back, and the big tent's there. 14,000 people in the city, and they filled the big tent and overflowed it. I had a hard time with my pride that I could come to my own hometown and fill up my tent, but I did overcome it. The first thing that happened was Dr. Morey was interviewed by the news media, And he said, you just go tell Oral to forget he ever had tuberculosis. That had a tremendous impression on me about doctors. Because this man had the evidence. And doctors go by evidence. And the second was my Uncle Willis. Uncle Willis was my father's oldest brother who had gotten oil money. And Papa had sold our farm the year before. The oil field struck in Pontotoc County and went to preaching. He sold our farm for $800 and took us children. And his two older brothers got wealthy in the oil. Also, his father got quite a bit of oil money. And we became the poor relations. And I was born a stammerer. And I was one of 5 children. 3 of them were boys. I was the baby. I was a stammerer. And the middle boy, Vaden, who lives here in town now, he and I were almost like twins. I was 2 years younger, but I was tall, and he was shorter, so I soon was as tall as he. And we were like twins. We really loved each other. But he was bright, outgoing, could talk. And when I tried to talk, I couldn't cut the mustard. I mean, it just stick in my mouth. And one day, Papa said to Uncle Willis, that was my rich uncle, he said, Willis, which one of the boys you think will preach, Vaden or Oral? He said, Vaden. He said, why do you say Vaden? He said, because it'll be that little one right there, Oral. And Uncle Willis said, it won't be Oral because he can't even talk. Now, we had the big tent up. And this is 20 some odd years later. And I was preaching. And the tent was so full, they were standing around the whole tent, standing up. And I looked, and there stood Uncle Willis. You know, there's some carnality in every one of us. And I made the invitation, and here came Uncle Willis. And I got clear off the stage, and I put my arm around him. And I said, Uncle Willis, why are you up here? He said, Oral, I've come to get saved. He was 77 years old and had never been converted. And I said, Uncle Willis, you think I can preach? By that time, he was crying so hard, it didn't make any difference. And Uncle Willis got saved. Oh, brother, brother. Now then, I want to come to the point of abundant life called the nonchalance of faith. The Bible principles for abundant life by faith. Through Jesus Christ, by faith. Faith is the major cause that moves the devil out of your life. Faith is the major power that causes the healing to work, whether it's medical or it's spiritual or miraculous. Faith is the thing that brings God on the scene and that changes things. We took the big tent to Dallas in November 1948, and that was the month that Richard was born. And we were there for 16 days. And the first night, there were, maybe 20 sponsoring pastors, but the leading pastor, Reverend Albert Ott, who had the largest church in Dallas, very, very outstanding man, did not know me and decided not to cooperate as a sponsoring pastor, but to come. He and his wife sat on the back row, and that night, for some reason, the opening night, I sang my one and only little song when he reached down his hand for me. And at the end of the service, he came up and he said, when you got up and sang that song, the power of God came through that crowd to the back row. And I put my elbow on my wife's rib and I said, honey, he's got it. And he said, I've come up here to be one of the sponsors. And Albert Ott became one of the greatest friends. Older ones here will remember Albert Ott. He's with the Lord now. But we went 16 days, and I was to close on a Sunday night. It's going to get real interesting now. I was to close on a Sunday night because Evelyn was to have the baby on Wednesday. You see, doctors are smart, and they know these things. They tell a woman what day they're going to have the baby. So we decided that we'd conduct that tent crusade through Sunday night. And during the service, the crusade had become so large and powerful that the pastors came to me. And they said, will you stay 3 more days through Wednesday night? I said, I can't. My wife's going to have a baby Wednesday night. And I promised Evelyn that I'd be home to be with her for the birth of our child. And they said, Brother Roberts, if you'll stay 3 more nights, there'll be hundreds of people saved, because they were getting saved by the hundreds every night. And I said, well, just hold on. And I asked the chairman to go with me to a phone, and I phoned Evelyn up here in Tulsa, and I said, darling, can you put that baby's birth off? Now, look, I was as innocent. It never occurred to me that faith couldn't do anything. You remember what you said back?
You said, can you put it off 1 day? And I said, well, the doctor says he's supposed to be born on Wednesday, but I'll agree with you.
No, I said if you'll... Oh, I get to tell her something. One time. All the husbands say one time. I said, honey, I'll drive home after Wednesday night and have the baby on Thursday night.
I said, no, you'll be so worn out then you won't be any help to me. So we'll just... I said, we'll just put it off 2 days to Friday. And,
you said that?
Yeah. And you said, all right, will you agree with me then on the phone? We agree in prayer that the Lord will hold up the birth of the baby till Friday. And I'll come home Wednesday night and you'll have Friday to rest.
Richard, just hold steady. I'll get to you in a minute.
On my other children, Richard wants me to tell this because it does make this credible. The other times when I had my babies, they came exactly when the doctor said they would come. And so this was putting it up, you see, a couple of days. And it would be a miracle and God would get the glory for it because I had nothing to do with it and the doctor had nothing to do with it. And you had nothing to do with it. We prayed and believed God.
Oh, I had a little to do with it. Now, will you all simmer down and let me tell the rest of this? Because what was happening was the nonchalance of faith. When you really get into faith, hear me good, because when I get into what I'm about to say, I'm really effective, and when I'm not in it, I'm not as effective. You don't really sweat it. When I heard Larry Lee say that once, don't sweat it. I notice when I try to have faith and I beat myself over the head almost, believe, it just seems like it won't work. Yeah. But faith really is active when you reach a point that you just sort of know that you know, and it's no big deal, and you know it's going to happen. And we were on the phone agreeing to put off a baby's birth 48 hours. And I came home, and Friday night she cooked dinner. Of course, I volunteered, and she declined. And you had your bag packed, and we were sitting there eating, and a big pain hit.
That's right.
You, not me. And you said, Oral, I believe we better go. And we went to Hillcrest Hospital.
Well, I got up and called the doctor first and said, I'm on the way to the hospital. And he said, well, I think it's about time. And he asked me how far the pains were apart, and I told him. He said, get on up here now. So we left. We had a guest for dinner. We left the guest and had a babysitter there with the other children, and you and I went to the hospital. And we had agreed, something you didn't say, we had agreed on the phone.
He'd be born before midnight.
Right.
And when you got there, the nurse met you, and you remember after she examined you what she said?
She said, I'm going home because this baby won't be born until tomorrow morning. And I said, nurse, you better not go home because this baby's going to be born before midnight. And she said, oh, no, honey, you're not going to have a baby till in the morning. I'm going home. And, well, she went home, but they had to call her right back.
I was sitting out in the waiting room. As usual, I was writing a book. And I was sitting there writing while my wife was in there doing her part of the deal. And there was a young man, he was just pacing the floor like this, pacing the floor. And I was sitting there writing, and he was pacing the floor. And I was writing away. He said, you're writing, huh? Yeah. What are you writing? Book. What's it about? It's about God. Who are you? I'm a preacher. What's your name? Roberts. Oral Roberts? I said, yes, sir. He said, don't leave. Sit right there. And he disappeared inside. Pretty soon brought his wife back. And she rushed up and she said, are you Oral Roberts? I said, yes. She said, in person? I said, yes, I believe I'm in person. She said, oh, Brother Roberts, I've been here 3 days and nights, and my baby just won't come. I said, sit down. And she sat down. I had my Bible. I said, this Bible says that women will be saved in childbirth. She said, it does? I said, yes. It's as natural for a woman to have a baby as it is for her to drink water. She said, it is. I said, yes. I said, I want you to go in there and have your baby. She said, okay. And was it 11 or 11:20 when they wheeled her by you?
About 11:30 when they wheeled me in and they wheeled her out. And she said, I beat you. I had mine first.
Oh, God.